So we work a lot with this group called Smart Name. Have any of you all heard of them before? So they're a really great group that thinks a lot about how storytelling is important in organizing. So if someone could volunteer to read that out loud, that would be great. Okay.
People use stories to process the information we encounter from our families and upbringing, educational institutions, religious and cultural institutions, the media, and our peers and community. We remember our lived experiences by converting them into narratives and integrating them into our personal and collective web of stories. Just as our bodies are made of blood and flesh, our identities are made of narratives.
That's great. So, yeah, so any thoughts on that quote? Does that pull up, kind of resonate in any specific way for anyone?
Well, to me, it just says that each person is important. Each person will have a chance to say how they really feel. Not necessarily opinion of what happened, but maybe a little bit of what their experience was with such and thus, and actually be heard, and it's actually going to be used.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think for me at least, it also speaks to how we kind of perceive each other's experiences is also framed through the stories that we have within our minds already, right? And the values of so someone who's unemployed, someone who has kind of the story in their head that all you have to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that story is going to seem very different than someone who sees, a bigger crisis going on. And so, actually, let me go back to this. They talk a lot about, They also talk a lot about how stories are not just, things that we tell, but within stories are embedded values. And so, kind of the story, both our personal story and also the story that's told in the larger, in the mainstream media or by politicians about how the world works has those values embedded within them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I think we see within organizing people saying, well, if people just knew the facts, then their minds would change, right? But what Smart Meme kind of points to is that because these stories that have values embedded within them kind of frame how we see the world, if those facts don't fit into that story, then it just gets shut out, right? So it's really about changing what the story is and the value that's embedded in those stories to make, that those facts make sense. Mm-hmm. And so we talk a lot about, it's not just about telling our own story, but also breaking down what the popular story is, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to understand both of those. And so we want to look at, in these bigger kind of cultural stories, what are the images, who are the heroes, who are the villains, what's the conflict, and then really trying to get at what's the value that's embedded within that story. And then also that these stories play really important functional roles within keeping the structure how it is. And so who benefits from these stories, right? So I put out some examples of really common,
stereotypes, basically.
Yeah, so common stories that you could even ask, a lot of these you learn when you're a kid or in school or, so for example, Columbus discovered America, right? Right, so, just really quickly, what are the images and heroes in that story? Who are the villains? But really getting at what's the value and who serves, what does that story serve, right, to justify? And I think that those are really obvious examples, right? We can kind of tell that that's a constructed story, but there's, I think, ones that are a lot more subtle. And we see a lot in healthcare the story of the free market economy as being a story that's told that has the value embedded within it that, if this isn't working for you, then this is your fault, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the structure's fault. Again, also with the immigration, which is you see that a lot in the news media right now, and the story that's told within that. And I think it's really useful. I find it really useful to when I watch something, just pause and say okay, what's being told through this? And we're actually going to do a little bit of that. I'm going to skip that one. So Smart Meme also talks a lot about what they call the battle of the story. And so what they say is to really have effective organizing campaigns and really to build a movement, you have to not just change the facts, but really change the assumptions and the base story and the values that are part of that. And so, and talking about how stories, again, are both reflect and shape relationships of power. So we get told these stories because of how the world works, because it can to prop up the current system of how it is. And so part of what we've really found is that putting people's lived experiences and those stories forward are really a great point to kind of undermine the common story, right? So in healthcare, at all of the forums that we would have or public events, we would always start with people telling their actual experiences of what they've gone through. You know, I lost my house, or I went medically bankrupt, as a way to kind of counteract that the predominant story. So we're going to watch a little video. And so I was just telling Kira, normally we'd watch it on the internet, but since we didn't have it, I had to record it on my computer. So it's a little bit funny. So this is a video from The Daily Show, where they break down or kind of have a series of different clips from these mainstream news outlets where they talk about poverty and taxes. And so let me pull this up and make sure this works. And so we can kind of break down a little bit what the story is that they're telling. Let's see. And I don't in any mean to place this as a... Okay, so this is me recording my computer.
So $700 billion of raised revenue over 10 years ain't even worth
You can make it
the effort. I assume
bigger.
folks have the same line or attitude towards low-level spending cuts.
National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, all those kind of frivolous things, those should all be on the chopping block.
Federal employees don't pay for parking, so if they just set up a parking for that, they get them $140 million. He doesn't have to waste your tax dollars and travel around in a $1.1 million luxury liner. Why are we spending $6 million? Why are we spending $1 million on the First Lady?
You gotta start somewhere. Even when we talk about NPR, $1 million here, that's $1 million.
Oh, so when you cut it, it's $1 million. But when you tax it, it's I mean, all we have to do to raise $700 billion is cut 700,000 NPRs. It's almost too easy. But if it's revenue you want, there does happen to be another place instead of the rich that you can look for it.
Warren Buffett writing how the rich should pay more taxes, but saying not a word about the half of American households that pay no income taxes at all.
Is that fair when half the population pays absolutely nothing? 51%, that's a majority of American households, paid no income tax in 2009. Zero. Zip. Nada.
Many of them get so much money in tax credits that it wipes out any Social Security taxes or Medicare taxes they're paying. They are absolutely on a free ride.
You hear that, Coors? The free ride is start over. So it looks like you'll be walking to work, assuming you have a job. Chances are you probably don't have a job. So why are you asking us for a ride?
He's great. And Onion News is good too. The woman in Onion News, she's great too.
Economic problem. The solution to our economic problem isn't taxing the rich. It's
Broaden the tax base.
Everyone needs to pay something.
Before you start demanding one group pay more, maybe get everyone to put skin in the game.
that's the problem with poor people. They still have some of their skin. But you know what? Maybe they're right. Maybe Fox is right. Maybe the bottom 50% of Americans, while they already pay excise and payroll and Medicare taxes,
of it. It's the only way to make a significant dent. Now we're up to 1.4 trillion. And if you're worried about the poor, don't. Because they're defined by the census as a family of four making less than $22,350 a year. Four. $22,350 a year. They'll be fine.
Families in the United States are not what they used to be. When you look at the actual living conditions of the 43 million people that the census says are poor, you see that in fact they have all these modern conveniences. 99% of them have a refrigerator.
99% have refrigerators. You food-chilling mother... That's why it makes complete sense that the word poor in that graphic is in quotation. These people aren't poor, they're... I'm sure the other 1% of those people who don't have refrigerators don't have them, not because they don't have food, because they're always ordering room service. These poor people are living like they just won a showcase showdown.
81% have a microwave. 78% have air conditioning. 63% have cable TV. 54% have cell phones. 48% have a coffee maker. 25% have a dishwasher.
25% of a dishwasher? Although, to be fair, after a 12-hour shift of washing dishes, the last thing you want is to bring your work home with you. So you see, the problem with increasing the marginal tax rate on the rich, closing some corporate tax loopholes, isn't that it engages in class warfare. It's that it's fighting on the wrong side of the war.
It is all-out war on the productive class in our society for the benefit of the loser class, the makers and the takers. They want to take it from somebody else.
Everyone's jumping in the wagon no one wants to pull.
Parasites we have out there dependent on government. The raccoons. They're not stupid. They're going to say they're going to do the easy way if we make it easy. We're just like welfare recipients from across America.
Welfare will create generations of utterly irresponsible animals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those people. The poor. Be right back.
So, just really quick, I want to kind of break down a little bit, not necessarily Jon Stewart's commentary, but the actual clips
Right.
from that piece, because I think it does a really good job of putting them together. So, from that clip, who are the villains in this story that they're telling?
Poor people. Bottom 50%.
Right, and
The
so,
ones who own refrigerators.
so what are some of the ways that they characterize them as villains?
Having modern conveniences that I guess people who get money from the government shouldn't have.
They consider them luxuries, even though they're not.
Right.
It's always been like that. People in welfare can't get around their Cadillacs because they came to pick up their check. So that's still being just done a different way.
Right, and I think there is also too the victims. So who are the victims in this story that they're telling?
They're pretty productive. Yeah.
Right, and so what are they saying is happening to them?
Well, they're being taken advantage of for their work, and people are just continuing to suck the economy dry and then put us farther into debt.
Right, and I think the imagery of animals is really interesting in this piece, right? And I think that's a theme that you see in a lot of different characterizations of people who are marginalized, as referring to them as animals, and so dehumanizing them even further.
And just using the word the poor. Come on, you guys, the poor.
Right, so what is that, and he kind of pointed it out a little bit, but what does that say to you in terms of the quotations that they use?
That they're not poor, like that they're using their money for some other means that isn't like daily sustenance. I don't know.
It's very derogatory.
It's frustrating.
Right, and then and this seems to me pretty clear, but in this current, kind of economic situation, what role does this story play?
It creates a class war, for one thing. It creates a problem of classes instead of economics, and then you have different these classes fighting each other instead of realizing the power they have together to create a difference. So, divided we stand, united we fall. If you take these core of different classes and separate them, there is no way to get empowering these people to, those people to do that. I don't even know what word to use, but not poor. So that's the problem. It's a class war. And they're making sure that that's not heard. They're making sure that something else is heard. And it's the subliminal stuff that's dangerous.
And the other thing is, it keeps the people who are being oppressed from joining together. Because like you're like, well, I'm not like that, and so it's like they're like that, I'm not like that. You try to get out and like just don't look back, and so we can never actually change it because we are fighting amongst ourselves.
And if you look at the numbers, they're necessities. So 96% to 98% have a refrigerator. Well, how can you eat? Then it goes down. 63% have cable, satellite TV. But if there's nothing else you can do and you don't own a car or whatever, you want to hear the news, you want to hear John Daly or whatever, they've now made it so that you have to have cable. When I grew up, you just turned the TV on. Now you have to have cable. Then what was it, 25% had a dishwasher. I mean, just go, do you see what I'm saying? That needs to be changed.
Also, they're also trying to deny that the so-called 99% are really poor.
Right.
They're really bad off anyway. They're really just like, us, the rich. I mean, they have these fancy things or whatever, so that they're not so poor. It only compares it in terms of certain commercial products, not quality of life. Notice they don't talk about health care, those sort of things.
Right, it's a good point. Yeah, and it makes me wonder, who do you think the audience is for those clips?
Probably the middle class is going, what? Which is why we don't realize it's a class war. That's exactly why.
Yeah, I think both the function of the middle class and saying, why should we help out these people who are basically just moochers?
Exactly.
And then also working class people or poor people saying, oh, well, that's not me, and creating that kind of tension and fighting within poor and working class people. And I think you see now over and over the attempt to reframe the discussion, right? So it's not about raising taxes on the 1%, it's about putting penalties on the 1%, or on the productive class, right? So like even trying to reframe who the characters are in that story, in itself is very laden with values, and calling someone the 1% versus using the word productive class or words productive class has very different meanings embedded within them. So, and I think it's important when we talk about kind of making our own media and telling our own story, to recognize that we're not doing it in a vacuum, and that people every day are bombarded with this stuff, right? And it can be really hard sometimes to kind of break that story, and even in our own minds. And so I think Smart Meme talks a lot about how within this story, there's always going to be a point where it's going to be weak, right? There's always going to be a point where we can intervene, or we can undermine or show how what they're saying, what their story is, and the reality of what a lot of people are experiencing doesn't match up. And so I think that's why people telling their own stories is really important, because it really shows how, like again, going back to what Kip said, while people might have refrigerators, they don't have a job or health care, right? So the importance of our own stories to kind of undermine that. And so a lot of times when we're talking about storytelling, and even any kind of communications in a campaign, we break it down into the problem, solution, action. And so when we make videos, a lot of times it's broken down into that. When we're talking, at a forum with like candidates or politicians, we talk about things like that. So saying, there's a crisis, people are suffering because they don't have access to health care. We should have a healthcare system that's based on human rights and meets everyone's needs. That's why we need to organize, or that's why we need to, pass this bill to establish universal health care. And so the Stories Project is not kind of just a floating out there thing, but it's really part of documenting the problem section of how we see the campaign, of how we see all of our communications. And again, using media as an organizing tool, so we're not just having these like anonymous interactions with people, but we're really using it as a way to build relationships. And we talked a little bit about, obviously we recognize, and just from watching that clip, that the stories that the mainstream media and the corporate media tell serve to keep the system that we have in place, right? So that's why it's so important that we tell our own stories and make our own media. We're going to go into a little bit about actually doing the Stories Project, and I'm going to get you as a handout 1 second. Any questions or thoughts or reflections or of what we've talked about so far?
Have you guys seen the John Taylor stuff?
John Stewart.
Oh, John Stewart, seen John Taylor. So funny. And Onion News, she's good too. They're good.
So let me give you this. Sorry. Okay. So this is the Stories Project tool. So when we were really focusing just on looking at healthcare as kind of the starting point to talking about all these issues, it's a lot easier to go and ask someone like, what's your experience with healthcare in some ways? Like you can ask them specific questions about that, but when we're looking at all these bigger, issues, it can be kind of hard to break into that, right? So it can be like, how has the economic crisis impacted you? And people are like, I don't know. Or some people have really specific answers, but a lot of times I think we're also taught a lot to not acknowledge the things that we're struggling with and not to talk about them. And so we have this toolkit. So this first page kind of goes over the overview, and we can skip that. So if you guys want to go to the second page. So this is really just a tool to help people start those conversations. And some people are really good at asking people questions and helping them kind of draw out, what their experiences are, and other people need a little bit more help with those questions. And so that's what this is designed to do. So basically the idea is that we set up one-on-one times with people to sit down and talk. And we'll go through, and it's very similar to a survey format. So we go through and ask them, like the first question of, of some fundamental needs, what would you say that you or your family or your friends or are struggling with? And then the second question is kind of focusing on cuts to services or how different services have affected people. And I think that's an area too where not even necessarily just thinking about it in terms of like social services, but even stuff like libraries or roads or all these other things. And then the third question is really kind of getting to, what are people's thoughts about human rights and what our community's obligations are to each other to make sure that our needs are met. And that question is a little bit more for the organizing side than necessarily for the testimonial, right? So kind of after going through the first three questions, so say I'm doing the Stories Project with Kira, and she says, I have a lot of issues with education. Like that's something I'm struggling with a lot. Then there are different sections for the different topics so that you can kind of get into deeper questions,
Like
right?
the meat of it, yeah.
So we sometimes have done this exercise where, so actually, Kara, I'm going to use you as a guinea pig. So how was fourth grade?
Fourth grade was really rough.
It was really rough.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really hated my teacher. I had like some kids in my class, and there was always like catty girls, and we were switching best friends a lot. I changed my name. I like went by a different name. I went by Sabrina because all of my best friends started with S. I was like completely insane. And I went to Oak Grove School in Brattleboro at that time.
And do you remember who you sat next to in fourth grade?
I tried really hard to sit next to Sam Whalen and Sarah Mitchell.
And why did you try to sit next to them?
Because they were my friends, and we were all part of the same group, and we had to sit next to each other.
And did you take the bus to school, or did you walk, or how did you get to school?
My mom drove me.
Okay. And do you remember what that drive was like?
Not really.
No.
Kind of fuzzy.
Thank you. So, Kira was, you have great answers. Normally when we ask people how was fourth grade, they're like, fine, or I don't know. but then asking kind of more. So you're good. You actually like gave good answers, or you had actual like recollections. But a lot of times, like if you're thinking about an interview, or like if you ever listen to someone interviewing someone in radio or TV, trying to really ask questions that will pull out, details, right? So we did it once with someone who was like, I don't remember fourth grade, and then we asked her who she sat next to, and she was like, oh, it was this guy Michael, and he does boogers, and like everything, and like all these details came out.
Sometimes you ask the questions and you draw a blank, and Kira tried it yesterday, and even I drew a blank. When you're like put on the spot to answer,
Right.
and it's a paper, or you're talking to somebody, you draw a blank. Just a few words that she said, a few things I went, oh yeah. Do you see what I'm saying? So the normal
Right,
person might just
right.
like, why are they asking us? They just totally blank it, or what do they want me to say?
Right.
There's always that, I want to please, they're asking me for a reason, but when you start being interested in saying, well, tell me about it, it doesn't matter whether it's what they want to hear, it's what happened to you, and
Right.
it's really important.
And that's a great point also within all these questions. Questions like, why do you think that happened? Or, and then what happened next? Or tell me more, and being okay with, there might be a 30-second pause for someone thinks. It can be kind of uncomfortable. We're not used to that, I think, in our daily lives.
Well, they might cry. Trust me.
It's very true. And I think it is an important point that these are like kind of deep things that people are dealing with, and that it sometimes can be emotional. So these questions are to kind of help people draw out some more details about what they want to share. And then after talking for a little while, what I'll usually do is say like, okay, we talked about a lot of stuff, and when you talked about the not being able to go to the doctor when you had that mole, like I thought that was really powerful. But then asking, so kind of you giving feedback on what you felt like really resonated, but then also asking the person like, what do you feel like was the most important part of your story that you want to share? Because I think that also helps people kind of reflect back on their experiences too. And so after that conversation, then we actually do the recording, or we call the storyline. And so I think I have one camera with me today. Maybe Kip, could we use one of your camera to record a testimonial also?
Oh, yeah.
And so it's
I assumed we would be doing that.
Great.
So it's only supposed to be 1 to 2 minutes.
Yes, and so that's a great point to let people know beforehand, is that, if someone has like a really intense story and they want to go longer, that's not a big deal. But the idea being that we don't edit them, like we just put them up as they are. And so saying, 1 to 2 minute story or testimonial, kind of encapsulating the most important part of what we talked about, or you feel like is the most important part to you. And then if you want to go to the end, the very back page. So we do have a release form, and it's also really important to let people know that we will be putting it on the website, and that it might end up in a longer video. But I think it's also important to phrase it like, where people all over the state have similar stories to you. Like, you're not alone, and that it's really important that we document all these things that people are going through, and show how all these things are connected. And so people don't feel like we're going to just like put their face up on the front of the website and be like, look at this loser, That it's like really about building a movement, and it's connected to all these other people's stories and about organizing. But it is important to get that too, and also because we might want to follow up with them later and go back and interview them for longer and or if other organizing kind of stuff happening. So that's important too. And so
Can I
actually,
ask this question?
Yeah.
This isn't me asking. This is me being someone who's answering it. I give my permission to the Vermont Workers Center to use my likeness. There are going to be people who are going to say, what is a likeness?
Yeah, I think this is like some legal mumbo jumbo, but it's basically means whether we use your voice or we use your face or yes.
So you can say that to them.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
And that's something that we've done too. Some people don't feel comfortable having their being videotaped, and so we can use the storyline. We can also, if you do have a video camera, we can like turn it so we just get their voice. So, and that's another option. We've also had people just write something if they don't feel comfortable with their voice or using their face, and but it all ends up in the same place. So it can be anonymous if people feel.
I just keep saying, be aware that there will be more people than you think that will not want their name or their face to be used
Yeah,
because they're
definitely.
concerned about reprisal, whether it's real or
Definitely.
not. That
Yeah, I mean,
is
especially
this is
we've
a
had
small
it
town.
with workplace stuff a lot too.
Yeah.
When people are talking about healthcare issues or like work dignity at work issues.
They're
So yeah,
terrified. Exactly.
definitely. But I think also thinking about this is like for a lot of people, sharing their story is one step in the organizing process too. So some of our leaders from the healthcare campaign came to a forum and they actually stood up and even though they were bawling, shared their story, and
Right.
that is a very transformative process in and of itself. So a lot of times people who share their story then kind of go on to become more involved and become leaders. Not everyone, but there are a lot of different options that people have. So actually I'm going to play you 2 examples that we have. So the first one is from the storyline where someone called up. And this is, his name's Walter, and he's someone who's really involved in Montpelier. He's been really involved with the healthcare campaign. And so this was the story that he shared. This is actually an MP3.
Hello, my name's Walter Carpenter. I live in Montpelier, Vermont, and volunteer with the Vermont Worship Center and have been for 3 years. The story I have is about getting a job as a person in late middle age after he lost his job. After I lost my job when I was sick, with the economy falling apart at the seams, and they deliberately sent jobs overseas at age 55, 56. You can't get a job because everyone thinks you're too old, and it's been really, really hard. I lost my job in Canada when I was sick. I was eliminated because they didn't want to pay benefits, and I have not been able to find a job since then that pays benefits or retirement, sick pay, vacation, anything like that. I could string together 2 or 3 part-time jobs here and there, but that's not all I can have. Something has to be done. We have to work to correct this. Thank you for your time.
Play a video. And so I think it's also, important for us to recognize too the kind of things that we need to work on. So we have a lot of people will use their cell phones to record videos, which is awesome. But there are definitely, especially with video, some issues with cell phones in terms of people speaking up. So that's another good thing to ask. Make sure you ask people to do. So this is a video that I think she has a great story, but the volume is not super loud.
Registered polysomnographic technician. That's my way of saying I'm a sleep tech at Fletcher Allen Healthcare. I've been working in the healthcare field for about 5 years now, but I've been personally affected by our healthcare crisis. When I was a college student, I didn't have health insurance and therefore didn't really have adequate access to healthcare because the cost was so prohibitive. So I ended up taking classes and I tried to find my own way
So those are two examples of testimonials, and I think something that we come up against a lot, or that we deal with a lot, is that a lot of times people think that unless they have like a really dramatic story or something that's like really major that's happened in their life, that they don't have a story. And part of this process too is asking people questions, that people also sometimes come to the realization that like they've also been screwed by the system, even though they may not have had this major life event, right? So there was one woman that I did a testimonial with who, she was like, I don't have a story, no story at all. And I started asking her questions, and I was like, have you always had health care? And she's like, no. She's like, oh yeah, and I used to have to buy medication from Mexico, basically, to stay alive. And so she's like, she'd been scraping by, so to her, it wasn't like a crisis.
Right.
Or maybe it was hard to admit that it was a crisis, but then she was like, wow, I really have like this really personal connection to this issue. And so that's another, I think, power of telling stories, is that it makes you kind of recognize your personal connection to all these things that are going on. So why don't we go ahead and we can break into pairs and try this out. And it would be great also while you're going through it, if you have feedback to give afterwards about like what worked and what didn't, to also let me know that too. So does that sound good?
Hi, my name's Kira Lewis, and I'm dealing with a healthcare issue. I recently returned from Central America after a trip there, and since the day that I returned, I haven't been able to keep my food down, and I've been having a lot of stomach issues, and so I hadn't been able to see a doctor. I just graduated from college and didn't have a doctor in the area, and most doctors have a wait of about 3 weeks before I can see anyone. So I recently went to see a naturopathic doctor who I then found out isn't covered under my federal health insurance plan. And so I'm now in the process of trying to switch to our state plan, which will take another several weeks, and can't get the care that I need at this moment because of this insurance issue. I also have medical bills from the summer that have been unpaid because I can't afford it, and I'm in the process of applying for a payment plan, which means that it might be harder for me to get the insurance through the state because I have outstanding bills. They're just, now that I'm not a student anymore, I'm realizing that it's really just unbelievably difficult and painful to be part of our healthcare system, even a better system like the one that we have in Vermont. And I think that we definitely need to have our new universal health care law make it much easier for people to get the care they need when they need it, and not worry that they'll be paying $700 or $800 to see a doctor, or that they won't be able to see the doctor that suits their needs most because it isn't covered. That's all I have to say.
I'm Kip Tewksbury. I'm from Marlborough, Vermont. And think about the most compelling or difficult situations actually have to do with one of our married children. April's 47, has two children aged just 12 and 6, and she's self-employed basically, and her husband is a self-employed contractor and painter, and so their income fluctuates a great deal. On health care, the children are covered by VHAP, so that's not an issue, but their income fluctuates enough that they go in and out of coverage for VHAP, but they don't have enough to apply for or pay for Catamount. So that, fortunately, they don't have any medical debts. They've been able to somehow make this work. There are no debts left over from the birth of both of the boys. But they have to budget very carefully. They have to live very marginally, and occasionally, for cash flow purposes, they need to borrow from us, which only when our cash flow allows it can we do, because we live very tightly on essentially Social Security, my retirement, my wife's retirement and part-time income. But, you know, they get by, but it's, you know, it's, if there were universal health care, obviously, they wouldn't have that, it wouldn't be an issue for them. The fluctuating income, you know, sometimes they do very well and sometimes not, and then they could focus more on regular needs, what they can provide for the children. I think that's sort of the most compelling current issue.